Found about 50 questions going all the way through. First of all, how much did you cringe?
Well, I don't know. It was. So I haven't seen it for a long time. The most difficult characters to make credible are the posh ones, oddly enough. They're always difficult to make credible. And bizarrely, on the tape is an old friend with an incredibly posh voice who's no longer with us now, sadly, Paul Foote. The journalist is one of the voices on the tape. And one was Patrick Cavendish, who was a writer. But they were the hardest ones, and I always find that slightly hard to swallow.
Is that because the real life people are like caricatures of themselves?
Well, they were two of them were the real people, but nevertheless, I think when you normally see them in films, they've been mediated by actors who modulate their voices into RP, and they're usually the good guys. So you know, the real thing is a bit like that, but hard to believe.
Is Alex Nevin meant to be representative of Airy Knees?
Well, I mean, there were a number of characters that we drew on, and obviously Airy Knees was one of them. But the guy Harris was a compositor. Well, he was a fictional character, but we drew on a guy called Colin Wallace, who had been in that position and who was framed. I mean, a most extraordinary story. He was a man who'd worked in PSYOPs, in military intelligence. He was involved, or they tried to draw him into that conspiracy, and he walked away from it, rather like Harris. And then he was framed on a murder charge. Most extraordinary story. Another character is a guy called Fred Holroyd, and he was an ex-army officer. He wouldn't go along. He was again involved in intelligence. He wouldn't go along with the shoot to kill, and he was put in a mental hospital. And so most extraordinary stories. Hence the references to mental instability and the shootings. But I did bring, because I hadn't touched it for 20 years, so I just dug out some books, and there's a paragraph on each one. I just thought it would be interesting just to, it doesn't take too long. This is one of the guys who worked with us a lot, a guy called Fred Holroyd.
The one you just mentioned.
Yes, and this is what he said. I said, bearing in mind he was an army officer. And he was working in Ireland at the time, in the 70s. And he wrote this. He said, "The dirty tricks I'm aware of involved all branches of the security forces with whom I worked in 1974 to 75, the Army, the security agencies MI5 and MI6, and the RUC. They were carried out on both sides of the border and ranged from the professionally disreputable to murder." That's the guy who was involved. Another guy, Colin Wallace was more involved. I mean, he was involved in the black propaganda. And this is, not to take too long over it, but this is what he says. This is what he wrote. During the 1973 to 74 industrial unrest in Britain, elements within the intelligence services began a planned political warfare campaign with the following objectives. A, to prevent the election of a Labour government in the spring of 74. B, to prevent a coalition between the Labour and Liberal parties, or to prevent any deal being struck between two parties to keep a minority Labour government in power, as had happened in the 60s. C, to prevent the re-election of a Labour government in October 74, and D, to bring about a change of leadership in the Conservative Party. That was Colin Wallace. And then the guy who really blew the whistle, Peter Wright, who was like from the far right, really. And this is what he said, and it's a slightly longer quote, so forgive me. This is him speaking. He says, and he talks about two attempted conspiracies. He said, feelings had run high inside MI5 during '68. there'd been an effort to try to stir up trouble for Wilson then, largely because the Daily Mirror tycoon, Cecil King, of blessed memory, who was a long-time agent of ours, made it clear that he would publish anything MI5 might care to leak in his direction. So there's nothing new in what really happened in this room. It was all part of Cecil King's coup, in inverted commas, which he was convinced would bring down the Labour government and replace it with a coalition led by Lord Mountbatten. But the approach in '74 was altogether more serious. The plan was simple. This is from a guy who was involved in it. In the run-up to the election, which given the level of instability in Parliament must be due within a matter of months, MI5 would arrange for selective details of the intelligence about leading Labour Party figures, but especially Wilson, to be leaked to sympathetic pressmen. Using our contacts in the press and among union officials, no change there, word of the material contained in MI5 files and the fact that Wilson was considered a security risk would be passed around. So that was their plan. So in a way, although it seemed like quite far-fetched, I mean everything in the film, so, I mean obviously the characters are fictional, but everything, the substance of the film was documented in that, I mean obviously there was much more, was documented in that way.
Do you think the film had any impact on sort of subsequent events in Ireland in terms of the peace agreement or American attitudes? Or because I noticed you used an American cast, which is unusual. You actually used mainstream actors, which is even more unusual. And the money came from Hemdale, who I think made people made Platoon. So it felt like there was a kind of an angle towards the American audience. Was that intentional?
No, the money came from John Daly, and they wanted. I mean, I hadn't done a film for a long time. Was not at all bankable, so they wanted a leading actor who they knew of, so Francis McDormand fitted the bill. And Brad Dourif was a well-known American actor, so he fitted as well.
Right. Okay. Who would like to ask a question? No.
I'm just trying to remember the actual real case, the Stalker case. I probably got it wrong, but I thought in fact he did come out a report linking politics, the army, the IUC, and so on. And the report was dismissed, and then he was forced to resign. But can you put me right about what actually happened?
Well, my memory was that he came back. The report was quite anodyne. Was my memory. I'd have to look it up again. But he didn't actually go public. He didn't say what he knew, and we did meet him, and but he wouldn't talk to us really. I mean, we met him just. He was polite, but he wouldn't talk. And plainly, I suppose the central point was that he knew lots, which he wouldn't say, which he wouldn't spill. And I think later he retired and he went into the security business. But he didn't basically blow the whistle. You know, I mean, yes, I guess he made a report, but it wasn't the earth-shattering report that it should have been.
Carrigan goes to the Republican Club was particularly.
Sorry.
The scene when Carrigan goes to the Republican Club I thought was particularly convincing. How authentic was it?
So just repeating case, it's a question of how convincing the scene of the Republican Club was.
Yeah, how authentic?
How authentic, sorry.
Well, we've been to a number of Republican clubs actually, and we're on the better parts of the research in the films. And the singers are, the singers who do those gigs. I mean, it was sort of a prototype for the various clubs that we went to.
And the crowd, the people who were there, were they?
Yes, I don't. I think the shooting was very interesting because we got chased out of Belfast. We couldn't get permission to shoot in Belfast at all,
Really?
so we had to do almost all of it in North London. And most of it is North London.
Chased out by who?
Chased out by the IUC at the end. We did the way we did it. We did a recce in at the beginning, when we just said, look, we're going to gather information to reproduce in London, but we shot then, so we got some shots then. And then we had to do the basic, I think it was 5 weeks shooting in London. Then we went back and did, just grabbed some shots, so like guerrilla filmmaking of the cars and the streets and all that. So that was, and I can't actually remember, I'm pretty certain the club was in London, and we went to Kilburn for the gang to be in it, and so there's no shortage of Irish in London.
Yeah.
Republican Irish in London.
I think I've been in several Republican clubs in the North of Ireland, in Belfast, and I can just confirm, if anybody's skeptical, that I found that extremely realistic. However, there is a moment in that in the drama. Oh, by the way, just an aside, we're discussing this film as if it's a documentary. It's not a documentary.
Really?
If you made a documentary about this issue, I dare say the nature of it, its form and content will be quite different. It will be more evidential rather than, if you like, dramatic. Now, in that bar scene, when the manager of the bar, who's the liaison person, sits down with the policeman and Ingrid, it seemed to me that here was a typical Loach moment. I say this with admiration of what you do, so I don't want anybody in the room or you to think that I'm being critical. I thought, here, I was waiting for it almost. And what do I mean by a typical Loach moment?
Can you ask a question?
Well,
Because you're kind of making
It's all right, I don't mind. It's okay.
Okay.
I'm commenting. I don't get a question out if you want. There's a conversation, a kind of conversation between the bar person and the policeman, which in a way isn't a conversation. That was one of the most unrealistic moments, I thought. What I mean by that is that what we had there was an ideological pronouncement given by the barman. It read highly ideologically mannered. Maybe that was your point. Maybe that was the Loach moment where the message has to be communicated unadulterated.
Well, I don't know. You see, if also in the conversation, the policeman was saying innocent people are getting killed, and there's no justification. You can talk about history, but there's no justification in killing people. That was the other half of the conversation. I mean, maybe you only heard the half that you were expecting to hear. But also, I mean, I think in answer to that, the problem is, and it's always the same with these kind of stories, that they're taken, we hear the stories as though they are in a vacuum, as though the stories have just happened. And every time we hear about the discussions of Ireland, it's as though there is no history. It's as though the Troubles, just began in the 70s, or they began with Bloody Sunday. But actually, of course, they didn't. They began in, as the guy says, 1169. And I found when I went there to the Republican clubs, people wanted to tell me that. They wanted to nail me to the wall so that I heard it. So, I mean, that was an echo of conversations we'd had. Bearing in mind, it was around about, whether it was this time or just a bit before, you couldn't hear Republicans speak in our media. Their words were spoken by actors. Didn't you remember? I mean, we were so removed from that conversation, from the, like the song, for example, the song they sang. I mean, you would never hear that broadcast. And so what shocked us, when we went to Belfast, or we went to West Belfast, there was a culture that you never hear, you never experience here. We never experience here. And so how can we be part of the solution if we never hear the conversations that people are having? So that's my defence.
Question of that.
Oh, right.
You mentioned that you got chased out of Belfast whilst you were filming, and that there was no. I grew up, or I haven't really heard much of the Troubles. I'm just curious what other kind of barriers you came across whilst producing and releasing the film. Where else you got friction from? Because it is, I suppose, it was quite a it caused a lot of controversy in the general public, and supposedly with the government and other forces. So I'm just wondering where you got the most friction from, other than getting
Well,
chased out.
it went to, the first showing was at Cannes, and there started to be articles about it in the press. I mean, the most notorious was a Tory MP called Ivan Lawrence, who wrote a piece. I don't think he'd seen the film, but he wrote a piece on a hearsay of someone else who had seen it, and called it the IRA entry, which was quite good for us down at Cannes, because suddenly you got a lot of interest in it. We didn't mind that, but then when it came back here, it meant that nobody would book it. So he got practically no screenings at all. There was a kind of big campaign against it in the press, and we just got very few screenings. And also there was a black spot put on it in other countries. I mean, other European countries where all our films, you know, if they do well, they do well there. We got very little presence in the European countries. So a word was going round, and we've never managed to track it down, but it was squeezed out. And as I say, the little, I mean, the woman who ran the little said that she had heard that it was anti the British soldiers, so she wouldn't show it.
That's because you know British soldiers in film at all, really, are
No,
they?
very few, very few.
Sorry.
How was it received in the Republic?
I was quite well. It was well in the Republic, not so well in the north.
Yeah.
Very well in West Belfast, part of West Belfast.
America. The US?
Yeah, sorry, the lady's asking how it did in America.
Not too badly. It didn't break through. I mean, it got a sort of respectable art house release, but it didn't break through really.
Because interesting, the Wind Shakes of Barley, which is what, 10, 15 years later, was a much bigger hit, wasn't it? Commercially, I mean, it was top 10 in the UK for several weeks.
Yeah.
And do you think the time was different, or that it was a different kind of film because it was historical, that people could tolerate it more?
Yeah, I think it was a different kind of film. I mean, there was still venomous publicity.
Of course.